I remember the first time I actually went into Afghanistan, we arrived on the plane at dusk, and I just remember it was this surreal experience. The sun was just setting, so I was able to see a bit of the landscape that first evening before the sun went down and everything became pretty much dark. That was one of my first recollections, was the darkness of the place, the lack of sort of ambient light, which was very different to most other places. And it wasn't until that first following morning where you got to look around, and it was an almost biblical kind of environment, for want of a better word. I remember standing with the WOMED from Med Platoon, and we looked out over the wall at the edge of the compound, and sort of played this game of, okay, see who can pick the first thing that couldn't have existed 2,000 years ago. And I think it was a motorbike came past, but up until then there was nothing that we could see in that landscape that really, was modern. So it was quite surreal, it was quite stark. A common theme, I guess, for most people was typically their first contact. Their recollection after that would be that it just felt surreal. It felt like training. They exposed themselves to undue danger, not because they were fearless, but because the fact that the rounds were actually real and that the explosions were real somehow just didn't quite register. And I heard that time and time again. My role in Afghanistan was as the psychology officer with the Commandos as part of special operations. And primarily what my role in theatre was to do was to provide that counselling and those brief interventions and psych screens to, at the end of the rotation, be able to help guys put some closure on their experience prior to them going home, and to get them ready for that transition to their homecoming. I think largely just the intensity of the fighting was a big thing. What I would do is, when I did the screens, it wouldn't be uncommon for me to see anywhere from 10 to perhaps even up to 25 or 30 soldiers in one day, usually from the same section or platoon. So you would get to hear that story told in 25 or 30 different ways consecutively, and hear it told from all these different angles. And that was a very unique experience. To actually sort of stand there inside the compound, see people coming back in and covered in dust, and, as you say, vehicles damaged or vehicles not returning at all in some cases. Wouldn't take long from when a patrol returned for people to start presenting and saying, yeah, I might want to have a word to you later, but more so, such and such a person may want to have a word to you, or could you just go and spend some time around them so that when they feel comfortable they can have a chat, because they're going to have some stuff that they probably need to offload. The blokes were very good at looking after each other in that sense. It was done in a very compassionate way. So hearing those stories firsthand when you're literally there, perhaps only a couple of kilometres from where the incident took place, is an extremely sort of confronting scenario, really. And it's something that, was, I think, very valuable, but also, a unique role. I'm lucky that I got to do that, because it made a very different experience when I did the follow-up counselling back in Australia as well, to help some people process things. I think monitoring the mental health of combat soldiers is critical in order for their capability to function both as soldiers, but also, more importantly, as individuals, to maintain a sense of purpose, well-being, both whilst they're in operations and when they come home. Because the reality is, with the conflict that we've experienced in Afghanistan, people redeployed in most cases several times, both to Afghanistan and to Iraq and to Timor and the like. So there was a lot of combat exposure, a lot of trauma exposure, and a lot of time away from home. So being able to allow people to have a space to discuss things, to try and work out what is a normal reaction to some of these experiences, where they fit in that continuum of how they've taken something on board, and then to assist them with that transition when they return home, was critical to making sure that people remained well and were ready to go back and do the job again if and when required. To a lesser extent, there were those one-off type things, those exposures when something traumatic happened whilst I was in theatre, and you try and provide those brief interventions. But at that stage, it's really about keeping people functional, keeping them in a state of mind where they can stay focused on their job, be not overwhelmed or distracted by what's going on. Theoretically, the psych screens are meant to be done at the end of a deployment and then 3 to 6 months after a deployment, to look at those post-operational changes once people have had a chance to settle down. With the tempo, what was starting to occur was that I'd be doing those post-operational screens and at the same time trying to check and see how people were in terms of being ready to deploy again, which was most likely the case. And commanders wanted to make sure the guys had the screens done to see if everything was in order before they went overseas again. So there was no time to wait. I remember with the SAS, it wasn't unusual for guys to be deployed 10 or 11 months out of the last 12 months when we asked about op tempo. So that's huge. What you tended to find though is that most people had signed on to do this for a job. They were looking at this as being a period where they're getting to do what they've trained to do. They're identifying it as a window of opportunity professionally and from a career point of view to actually perform their role. And so there are many soldiers who looked at it and said, I may not get this opportunity again, so I'm going to take it while I can, but that comes at a cost to family and personal life. And that was something that some people put on the back burner, and that's something that they had to deal with later on. The fighting season's a very interesting concept. There's that idea that over winter things are going to quiet down. The Taliban are going to go sort of back into the caves, retreat, settle for a while, and then as things warm up, both figuratively in terms of the temperature and in terms of the combat tempo, that it's going to become quite intense. And that happens most years. So it's that sense of people looking at the rotation cycle and getting a sense of when their company is likely to be deployed and what kind of deployment they're going to have. And I think for some people it's not so much difficult for them because that's what the guys have trained to do, but it can be difficult for families and friends, loved ones who have an understanding of that fighting season and understand that if someone's being deployed mid-year, it's likely to be a fairly risky deployment. So it has more of an impact on that side and how individual soldiers manage the home front. For Special Forces, I think one of the big things is strength of character, strength of will, that determination to stay calm and stay focused when anyone else, any regular person, would start to lose their composure. I think there sort of became a sense with the IEDs of it's just something you can't predict. So it became one of these factors in the battle space that everyone assumed would be likely to occur at some point. But in terms of what you could do to mitigate it, it was pretty minimal. So you just had to accept that as a reality, that when you go outside the wire, and even in the vicinity of the wire, there's that real danger there to be in an area where kids may still be running around, people may still be tending crops and fields, and suddenly an IED would go off. And that was more difficult because you've got civilians caught in the way and you're still unsure who's there and who might be firing and what could happen next. So extremely stressful. I think it's impossible to perform the roles that soldiers do on operations and to not have an attitude and to not have an interest, because you can't just do this job for the money. It's not about that. It's about wanting to make a difference. It's about wanting to be a part of something that's larger than yourself. And that's what actually allows people to not just go on one operation, but to go on several and to stay focused and to stay committed, and not just as individuals, but as a collective. I think for a lot of people, this idea of the worth of the mission is something that after a certain time, each individual's got to find their own worth and their own sense of purpose in why they're doing what they do. So for most, there's that inherent sense of wanting to be a part of something that's bigger than yourself when you turn up to the recruiting office and join the military in the first place. And that's what brings people to the army. People are only human. Despite all the training and the skill level and the intelligence, the aptitude, the motivation, things will take their toll. And I think the difficulty for some people is not going to be just in the tempo itself, but in now, how do they search for meaning now that this operation has come to an end? This has defined people. This is sort of the significant thing about their career. And I think one of the big experiences that guys had that I spoke to was having been away, having seen this environment firsthand, and then coming home to a cultural environment back here in Australia where people are largely unaware of what's actually happening in Afghanistan and what people are being through and what's being achieved and the like. And that can be very difficult for people to rationalise that I may have risked my life for 4 months, but when I come home, does anyone even notice or really care? I think the public are largely pretty supportive of what's happened. The difference really tends to be that the public also don't have a great idea of what's been going on in Afghanistan. So it's not people coming back to a country that is against what a veteran has done. It's more so coming back to a country who really doesn't understand, doesn't have a concept, and from a soldier's perspective doesn't seem to care about the risks that they've had, the losses that they've had, friends that they've seen killed and badly injured. I think one of the difficulties with trauma is that trauma can be quite insidious, that you can be exposed to something and at the time you can continue to cope quite effectively and remain quite functional. But then there may be a trigger, days, weeks, months, several years down the track, that brings that trauma out again. And what can be a real difficulty with trauma is that traumatic events in times of stress can actually tend to link up somewhat. So you may have something quite unrelated happen 10, 20 years in the future, which will cause you to recall quite vividly in some cases a traumatic event from the past. So that's going to be something that veterans will need to be aware of. In terms of post-traumatic stress, ongoing support is crucial. Not so much support that needs to be there all of the time, but there needs to be that easy access to support. The important thing is that for modern veterans is that they know where to get help, and when they need to access that support, that they're able to get over that barrier, whatever it might be, in terms of saying, hey, look, I need a hand to deal with this. As a psychologist, I like to liken this to the idea of having a physical injury. If someone falls down and breaks a leg or breaks an arm and they have a cast placed on it, there's a very clear concept of needing that rehab to get things back together, and it's a visible injury. With these psychological injuries, we don't see them. So it can be difficult for someone to say, I need support, because on the outside, people say, for what? I think anyone fears being forgotten. As an umbrella, people fear that their sacrifices of going into a combat situation may not sort of be appreciated by people, even though it's interesting, even though that's not the reason people go. They don't go to get some kind of respect, but once you've taken those risks, it is difficult to think that maybe other people or society doesn't value the risks that you've taken and the steps you've taken to try and preserve a certain way of life that you see as important here in Australia. So those who've had physical injuries, those who've had psychological injuries, are just going to experience those things more acutely. And the reality is most people will have been scarred or affected in some way, shape or form by this conflict. I think the concern is sort of for their ongoing care, not just care now, but ongoing. What's going to happen to them when the war is over, quite literally? Are they still going to get the same attention? Are they still going to have the same supports? Because by and large, to my understanding, the support that they get in defence is pretty good. Great efforts have been taken to make sure that these guys are looked after and that things are put in place to try and give them the best outcomes and give them access to the best rehab. But there is that concern of what happens further down the track when they're not within the service anymore, when they're out in the general population, in the general community, when you might be presenting to a doctor or a physiotherapist who doesn't have that understanding of what you've been through. And that's where therapists, physical health clinicians just need to have a greater understanding and a greater capacity to empathise. It's not about knowing what someone's been through, it's about allowing them to work through their experience and giving them space to do that. And that for most people can be quite comforting as well. And that's something that's going to become more and more important for clinicians out there in the general community as these guys who've been injured filter out and start to access supports well outside the realms of defence. And that will largely affect how people are able to cope with the injuries that they've sustained, I think. Self-care as a psychologist is a difficult thing. There's that joke that I must have heard one too many times about who psychs the psych. And to be honest, I never came up with a good answer. So for me, when I left the Defence Force, that was a very confronting thing because that's when I realised that just how much that I'd been exposed to myself on deployments and the traumatic incidents that I tried to push out of my mind that I personally saw, but also too that you need to process everything else that you've heard. as well, because you've taken on everybody else's trauma for so long, and that certainly did have a residual effect. So the most difficult thing for me was admitting that even as a psychologist, somehow that didn't make me impervious to being affected by these experiences. And it was realising that you are still quite human in every sense of the word. Even as a psych, that was something that I couldn't escape. And that's why I think it's critical for other soldiers, other veterans to realise that none of us are impervious to this. The difference for me was that clinically I knew what was going on. So I knew what the nightmares meant and how they were affecting me. That didn't give me the capacity to stop them, though. So even I needed to get that support with all my professional experience. So I don't think anyone should ever look and say, no, I can deal with this.